first we have a work study for drainage facility long-term maintenance program. Richard Beck, Michael Baker, International.
Good evening, Council. I am Ashley Christensen, Public Works Director for the City of Hemet. The purpose of tonight's work study is to provide the Council with information on a conceptual plan for addressing required mitigation of vegetation in our drainage structures throughout the city. As you know, the City Public Works Department has a program for maintenance of stormwater facilities such as our earth and road shoulders and our retention and detention basins. There are environmental agencies that also have jurisdiction over these facilities, and they have say in how we are able to maintain them. We are required to get a maintenance permit from each of the agencies, and as you've heard me say before, the permits can be a challenge to obtain as well as a challenge to comply with. So we are currently working to get our permit specifically with the Department of Fish and Wildlife renewed, and there's a lot of hoops for us to jump through. We have been working with Richard Beck of Michael Baker International for a long time and really trying to take what is currently kind of a shotgun approach to this maintenance and really consolidating it into one spot, which we think will bring benefits not only to the city, but also to developers and future customers of the city who have to deal with these same things when they're developing properties. So I'm going to introduce Richard and let him come up if he would. And he's going to provide you with a high-level overview of our current maintenance program, a little history, and review the conceptual plan that we've developed. What we are really looking for tonight as a result of the work study is we're hoping to get concurrence from Council on moving forward with this conceptual plan and really ferreting out the details and doing probably some more studies and things that will be required if in fact you are good with the idea that we've laid out in front of you tonight. So with that, I am going to let Richard take over.
Evening, sir.
Mayor Percival and council members, thank you for hearing me discuss and introduce the project, and Chris did a great job on giving some background on where we've been, and hopefully I can shed some light on where we're going. Just briefly, what I'd like to talk about tonight is introduction to the project, some of the facilities that are under the project and the overall program, those agencies that regulate the facilities that we're currently working with, and then ultimately how we have a successful program for operations and maintenance within these facilities. So the routine long-term maintenance project, it's a wordy project description, but it's a very important one. We do these all throughout the state for flood control districts, cities, counties, folks with a significant amount of facilities that are often regulated. Of course, those facilities need to be maintained to properly function. And rather than piecemeal applications for the maintenance of individual facilities, what we do is we group them all together and we create a program where it's all of the facilities but one set of permits. It's cheaper in the long run and much easier to navigate once those approvals come in. Within the city of Hemet, we have two types of facilities. Basically drainage channels, ditches, creeks, rivers, they're all basically the same. The nomenclature can change a little bit. And we also have basins. The basins were often constructed to store water temporarily after storm events, and then they drain. The types of maintenance will sound familiar. It's general and routine. So on an annual basis, usually it consists of mowing, sediment removal, exotics removal, anything that will help divert and convey water flow during storm events. That's the key function. From time to time, the maintenance includes channel repairs shortly after storm events, so it may be the patching of rock riprap for erosion protection or fixing other sloughing along the creek channels. What it does not include is capital improvement projects, additional facilities, the construction of, or expansion of facilities. So there are some limitations. But this is roughly 90% of the work usually that the city has to do is the ongoing maintenance. So what's important with the programmatic approach or the watershed approach is looking at the city overall and identifying what facilities are part of the program. So within the city's limit, we generally focus on the western side of the city is where the bulk of the drainage features and basins are present. It's a little hard to see, but all those yellow lines are either linear facilities and the basins are woven in. Some are much larger than others, but I caution you don't always use size as a factor as far as the difficulty to permit. So you can think of a smaller facility that may have a lot of water quality or sensitive species issues versus a large-scale facility that may be unvegetated. So there's a variety of facilities overall. Over 40 facilities are included in this program. I apologize, the picture on the left is a very narrow drainage channel that's a part of the program. And then we've got larger basins or facilities like Seattle Basin that, because of the lateral and vertical extent of the facility, it's fairly large, and the maintenance that has to occur within that basin would be more intensive than in the smaller roadside drainage channels that you often see. So when we talk about jurisdictional permitting and regulatory agencies, there's basically three that we're working on and working with. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers regulates pursuant to the Clean Water Act, so water quality, dredge and fill permits. The Clean Water Act Section 401 is regulated by the Regional Water Quality Control Board, primarily focusing on water quality as well as habitat. And then Chris mentioned the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They have a stream alteration permit that we're currently seeking. The Fish and Wildlife's jurisdiction is the broadest, and usually their permit approval is the most restrictive and has the most conditions. So that's why that's primarily been a focus over the last year, working with multiple regulators with that agency. So when we talk about jurisdiction, these agencies don't own or have any easements within these drainage facilities. They're under the city. However, the challenge is their jurisdiction is overlaid within these facilities. So any work, as far as the maintenance that I mentioned previously, would need to be permitted or authorized prior to that work being initiated. The permits that we're able to get are 5 to 10 years as far as a lifespan. So you get the permit, then year to year you're able to do your maintenance, and it's fairly efficient once you get the permits in place. These are the facility baseline conditions, so you'll see that they vary. Don't go by green, or don't go by how pretty the facility looks. They're all regulated, and for the most part these permits have general conditions that are applied to each facility. Generally, the more native habitat, for example, that's in the facility, the tougher it is to do some of that maintenance. We are working with past approvals that the city obtained many years ago. They've since expired, so the renewal process that we're working with is to get actually some of these facilities taken out of the jurisdiction so they're not regulated, and we've been able to decrease some of the facilities that were regulated in the past. The other item is to renegotiate our conditions, bring them up to date, and get rid of conditions that are not relevant to some of these facilities. One condition that will continue is the worker education program. So we have done training in the past with operations and maintenance staff, and that eliminates some of the surveys that are required by the agencies prior to doing the work. So what it does is it puts a lot of the condition compliance back into the local agency's hands. So maintenance crews are able to, in effect, do some of the reporting themselves rather than the agencies or a different consulting firm. As part of the worker education program, a field guide was created. It's a large notebook with each facility pictured like the ones on the right. And basically, the graphics are basically indicating the type of maintenance and if the maintenance is allowed year-round or if there's special restrictions. So the circle with the red line, for example, would be certain restrictions are in place prior to maintaining Seattle Basin, for example. With other facilities, you'll see a thumbs up, thumbs down, that type of nomenclature to make it very clear and simple whether or not you have a condition in place prior to the work. With any permit, as you can imagine, oftentimes there's numerous conditions, but the thing that's a challenge is the conditions themselves have conditions. So it can be very complex and time-consuming, especially as you're trying to prepare for the upcoming winter season. So we try to organize the permits as best we can. When you collectively take all the facilities, there's roughly 77 acres of area that's under jurisdiction of these other agencies. So it's very important. It's a large amount of area that is regulated and the conditions are applied to. So one thing the agencies require is compensatory mitigation, and that's to offset any impacts that these facilities may have through the maintenance. And you can think of the compensatory mitigation as an opportunity to either weed or replant in other areas owned by the city to offset that impact. For example, we looked at several mitigation opportunities in the past as far as preservation of certain areas like vernal pool habitat. And we also, with city staff, coordinated with the Resource Conservation District. There unfortunately was not any opportunities currently with those groups given the volume of facilities we have for this program. So what we were able to do is identify mitigation in Salt Creek, which is one of the facilities that gets maintenance. And it's one of the facilities that's under city ownership in most areas. And that's eliminated the need for acquisition and other types of compensatory mitigation that you often hear of. Within Salt Creek, we've identified certain types of vegetation that can be removed as far as non-native vegetation. We also can plant in the creek in certain areas and then avoid that with maintenance in the future. And then ultimately, the agencies have a conservation easement placed over that vegetation so it's protected in place. The last few slides are the opportunity that we've identified in Salt Creek, and this is the opportunity that we'd like to pitch to Cal Fish and Wildlife as well as the other agencies. Basically, Salt Creek, the limits are identified in yellow. You'll see orange and yellow habitat types. Basically, that's documented exotic vegetation, and we can go on and on about what the value of removing that is basically it's the mitigation effort for this program that would allow us to move forward with maintenance because the agencies see high value in the removal of such vegetation. This gets us to a certain acreage where hopefully the Cal Fish and Wildlife will take this as a successful mitigation approach. Once that's removed, we are looking to see if a portion of the channel can be vegetated, and we've done this multiple times in other jurisdictions. And it's usually planting one side of the channel and allowing maintenance to occur through other areas of the channel, so there's no impact to hydrology or future operations and maintenance. And finally, the look ahead is we're currently working with Cal Fish and Wildlife for interim approvals. The approval process for the programmatic all-encompassing permit package will take a little bit more time into 2019 given all the facilities. What's important is we keep the routine maintenance up, especially with the upcoming winter season. So we are working on the interim maintenance that will allow for mowing and clean out of certain facilities. We're also continuing to move forward with all the regulatory agencies. They all have input in their process, and their mandates are all a bit different. And then finally, we'll end up with a comprehensive permit package for the city. And it is very important, as I mentioned, the lifespan of these permit approvals are 5 to 10 years versus 1 to 2 years. And you have all the facilities in one permit package versus a piecemeal approach. And overall, it will decrease costs for the permitting that would typically be done for O&M and also piecemealing of mitigation. So with that, I can finish here with this last slide and keep this up. If there's any questions, I'd be able to answer those and happy to answer those.
Any questions?
Just a simple question. All of your slides depicted open channels. Any of this enclosed drains at all? So they're all open?
Most of them, certain culverts and boxes can be still jurisdictional, but they don't have any mitigation applied to them. So typically those underground facilities may have sediment removal, so that would be included in the package. I'm not sure if there's any specific other than small culverts that would be included.
Yeah, just thinking that oftentimes those culverts with the grates on them become choke points for drainage, and so that's an important part of clean out and mitigation, because when we do get those occasional rains and things fill up, that's where we can have problems, because those funnel into tight storm drains, and the water then backs up. So
yeah, that blockage, and of course the upper picture here is a good example of that, where debris can collect. So what would definitely be included is the removal of debris all around that, as well as the inlet that's in the bottom picture as well. So that's a very good point. I think overall the intent as we move forward is to keep the council up to date, and once we reach another milestone where it makes sense to come back and provide an update, we'd be happy to do so.
Thank you. And I've got one question for you. Do you know what kind of a time frame we're looking at getting these permits and approvals from these various agencies?
The interim approvals, we're hoping to take this and pitch it to the agencies this week. That interim approval would allow us to do maintenance in October, coming up this year. And then as we look into next year, probably by summer would be a fast move.
I know there's a couple pressing projects that
Correct.
we're waiting on to get these.
Correct. What often happens is one of the agencies like Cal Fish and Wildlife will issue their approval, which allows you to do certain types of maintenance. And then, of course, the federal government with the Corps of Engineers is a little slower, and then that approval typically follows. But we are trying our best to typically do concurrent processing, and that's also one challenge in the past is the conditions of these approvals didn't always match. So we're trying to make sure that the conditions with these permits is consistent overall, so the city staff and O&M staff don't have to do multiple things in the same facility.
All right. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
One question. Does the maintenance of these facilities, does it ever get impacted by these governmental agencies who don't allow private property owners to maybe do what they have to their bare land I'm thinking mainly of RCA and all of the habitat and the endangered species that we have, and they tell private property owners, I'm sorry, but you can't disc that because there's fairy shrimp out there, and that usually comes into bearing on some of this stuff. So are the city facilities impacted by?
Well, I was going to say all the time, as far as globally. The biggest challenge and the best example right now is the mandate between fire departments and the mandate of Cal Fish and Wildlife, and they don't match. Mm-hmm. And you may have landowners that get fire weed abatement letters, for example, and if it's in a creek in the back of their property, then they still need a permit. It's not a waiver or an exclusion, unfortunately. So what we're trying to do, and what we have done, though, is recognize what those facilities are early on as far as the city facilities, because there are facilities on private lands that the city is not responsible for. And then we do basically a triage approach. So, for example, those interim maintenance approvals that I mentioned coming up, we've kind of got our top 10 list of facilities that are a favorite to continually do O&M within those facilities. But yeah, the competing mandates are a challenge, and oftentimes you'll have one agency give an approval and the other agency wants to hold it back, and so it's a negotiation for sure. And the city staff has an excellent relationship with the regulatory agencies, and confident that in 2019 we'll get our permits for the next 10 years. Hopefully, it'll be great.
Very good, thank you.
Along one more coattailing on that issue. When you do have those predictable areas where you're going to have the conflict, what's the likelihood of getting one pre-established understanding and agreement so that you don't have to keep going back because I'm looking at one of those areas I'm familiar with, and not only is there plant material that grows up in there, but it's a tremendous collection basin, if you will, for tumbleweeds that blow in. So obviously, up close to a housing development, they're concerned about the tumbleweed fire hazard issue, and it's not even something that's growing in there,
Yeah.
but it's something that needs to be abated for fire prevention hazard.
It's high. The likelihood's high. I would have quit long ago if it wasn't. Ultimately, what happens is all the agencies come together and they get that understanding, because they also have the understanding that O&M and Public Works also has a mandate. And it's back and forth, and the biggest challenge oftentimes is agency staff turnover at the governmental agencies. So you've moved far over the years and that person leaves, so it's kind of a start over. But 95% of the time, 99% of the time, we reach a conclusion, and it's just literally a negotiation and a discussion. And the mitigation comes into play as well. And that's why we have kind of a thorough program within Salt Creek to hopefully get buy-in from all the other agencies.
Yeah, it just seems logical that once you reach a consensus on this particular location, that staff turnover really shouldn't apply, because you can go to the records and say, on this date, we had this understanding, and nothing's changed.
That's right.
It's frustrating.
It's yeah. My gray hair hasn't started too much, but it definitely happens. You know, there's some challenges. So
Thanks.
but thank you, and we'll definitely get through it.
Thank you. You have anything else?
So just want to make sure we're good with moving forward in terms of starting to dig out the details so that we can come back to you guys.
Yes,
Thank you.
and I say that because we have some projects that have to get done.
Okay.
Right. Thank you. Okay, up next, opportunity, we're going to go into closed session. Does anybody have anything they want to comment on a closed session item? If you do, you can do so at this time.
Mayor, I do have one item that I'd like to ask the council to add tonight. The council was informed that we were seeking to meet with the Hemet Police Officers Association. We had a number of dates. We didn't lock down the date to speak with them until after the agenda was out, which is why we didn't put this on closed session. But we did manage to speak with them today. And I do think that it requires some consultation with council before our next agenda meeting. So if we could add this as an item of subsequent need, I would appreciate that.
You heard the request from the city attorney. Is there a
I
motion
so
to add it?
move. Yeah.
Is there a second? Second. Okay, please vote. And that passes 4-0. That's what it needed. Okay. So with that, is there anybody that would like to speak on a closed session item? Seeing none, we will recess into closed session.